We will today discuss language and thought, and with that, imitation, practice, frequency, input, and discourse. Thought and language are two distinct cognitive processes, but they grow together. We have already discussed Wolff-Sapir hypothesis in detail, which proposed different perceptions about language and thought. And then we have also seen different researches that have been done to look at language and thought. And the consensus is that although they are distinct cognitive processes, but they are closely connected and related to each other. With that, we have to see imitation, practice, frequency, input, and discourse. And especially in the case of children, we see that they are very good imitators. They imitate and mimic whatever they hear from their adults. And then practice is behavioristic view, which says or which claims the habit formation which comes from repetition and development of association. Also, input plays a very crucial role in children's language acquisition, which means the kind of input a child receives from parents and siblings and friends plays a crucial role in the development of language. And then we also have discourse, which is highly connected to conversational rules, that is, analyze children, and their conversational analysis will tell us that how they detect pragmatic or intended meaning and what are the key features of the conversational analysis. How do children acquire these conversational rules? So all these are the key characteristics of understanding language acquisition processes. Now we will look at each one of them separately and individually to form our own opinion about them. We see that we have language and thought, and we have different views from different schools of thoughts. Especially we have behaviorism, who believe that cognition is too mentalistic. Then we have Piaget understanding, Jean Piaget, who proposed that language is dependent upon and springs from cognitive development. So the emphasis is on the cognitive development. And then we have Vygotsky, who believes that language is a prerequisite to cognitive development. And he highlights the idea of social interaction. Especially, he proposed ZPD, which is zone of proximal development, according to which every child reaches his or her potential development through social interaction with adults and peers. Then we have imitation, and we all know, and it is a very informal observation, that children are good imitators. We think of children as imitators and mimics, and then conclude that imitation is one of the important strategies a child uses in the acquisition of language. Imitation is connected to the behavioral principle of language acquisition. Behaviorists assume one type of imitation, but a deeper level of imitation is far more important in the process of language acquisition. The first type is surface structure imitation, where a person repeats or mimics the surface strings, attending to a phonological code rather than a semantic code. But the children perceive the importance of the semantic level of language. They attend to a greater extent to that meaningful semantic level, which is the deep structure of language. They engage in deep structured imitation. In fact, the imitation of the deep structure of language can literally block their attention to the surface structure so that they become, on the face of it, poor imitators. Then we have practice versus frequency. Practice and frequency are closely related to the notion of imitation is somewhat broader question, the nature of practice in child, which means, do children practice their language? If so, how? So it is common to observe children and conclude that they practice language constantly, especially in the early age of single word and two-word utterances. A behavior model of first language acquisition would claim that practice, which is repetition and association, is the key to the formation of habits by operant conditioning. Then we have input. Now, in terms of input, we have to be very careful that what type of input the children receive from their adults, because adult input shapes child's acquisition and interaction pattern. Now, the interaction pattern between child and parent change according to increasing language skill of the child. Nurture, that is the social development or nurturing, and environment in this case are tremendously important, although it remains to be seen how important parental input is as a proportion to total input. So the key is basically the parental input. Then we have discourse, where children learn not only how to initiate a conversation, plus how to respond to another's initiating utterances. Now, while it is used to be generally held that mere exposure to language is sufficient to set the child's language generating machinery in motion, it is now clear that in order for successful first language acquisition to take place, interaction rather than exposure is required. Children do not learn language from overhearing the conversation of others or from listening to the radio, and must instead acquire it in the context of being spoken to. Questions are simply questions. They are not simply questions, but are recognized functionally as requests for information or action or for help when they are responding to another's initiating utterance. At a relatively young age, children learn subtle differences. Utterances have both a literal and intended or functional meaning. Thus, in case of the question, "Can you go to the movies tonight?" the response, "I am busy," is understood correctly as a negative response, such as, "I cannot go to the movies." So, over the period of time, children learn to infer and understand what the literal and intended meaning is. To conclude, the development of first language acquisition has been discussed with the perspective of language and thought relationship, imitation of adult speech practice and frequency, role of input, and discourse analysis.